Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. We just want to thank you all for joining us. And before we begin, I would just like to give you a little bit of background on Biltmore Capital Advisors, for those of you that are not familiar. We are an independent SEC registered investment advisor, and we're based in Princeton, New Jersey, and Boca Raton, Florida. We work with families all across the country. You can see some of your financial planning and asset management services we offer up there on your screen. And you can go to our website, www.biltmorecap.com, to learn more about us. And now we're going to go ahead and move on to our asset protection webinar. Our presenter today is Dr. Donald R. Chambers, Chief Investment Officer of Model Portfolios here at Biltmore Capital Advisors. Dr. Chambers is a noted author and speaker on finance and investments. He's published 5 books and over 50 articles. We ask that you feel free to type in any questions while the seminar is in session, and Dr. Chambers will try to answer as many questions as he can when the presentation is completed. Go ahead, Dr. Chambers.
All right. Thank you, Thalia, and thank you to everybody tuning into the webinar, especially to our existing clients who've placed their trust in me and the rest of the Biltmore team. We appreciate that, and we'll try to give you some information now about how we view this keeping your assets safe. The question arises, do you ever worry about your financial assets, that they're really safe and they're going to be there when you need it? Have you ever even woken up in the night worrying about it? Well, that's what this webinar is about, is to try to put some of these risks and some of these anxieties in perspective. Here's a picture that I like that reminds me of when I was younger and didn't have much money and kind of carefree. This is some college students. I took it off the web who are down with a host family internationally. And it surprises me as I've grown older that by attaining enough wealth to live a comfortable life, instead of me being less concerned about money, there's a tendency to become more concerned about money. I was in the Philippines lately, and I was surprised how relaxed some of the people there were, even though, frankly, I don't think they had a lot of protection from financial disasters, at least certainly not as much as we have. So let's talk about those risks, and maybe by the end of this webinar, we can feel a little better about how safe our assets really are. In order to structure this conversation, I want to divide it into 4 types of risks. So across this top axis up here, I have the types of assets, and on the left side, it's real assets. Those are the tangible things we can see, like our home, our automobiles, our boats, even our own human health, our ability to do work. That's called our human capital. That's what economists call it. Versus financial assets. And financial assets are stocks and bonds and various funds. It's these claims to money. The other dimension that I want to talk about is some sort of individual event, or to be frank, some sort of individual catastrophe. It's just something that happened to you, or maybe to 100 other families or 1,000 other families, but certainly not a widespread disaster across the nation or the world. And then I want to divide it into large, wide-scale events. I'm not even talking about a hurricane here that might affect thousands. I'm talking about something that affects hundreds of thousands, millions, or even hundreds of millions of people. And these 4 different possibilities, the real versus financial and individual versus economy-wide, are very different in their solution and their level of risk. So I want to deal with them. First, let's talk about the risks that we have to real assets. That's not really the topic of this webinar, but it helps set it up. Are we protected for risks to our home and our automobile and even our human capital, our ability to work, against an individual event, something that just happens to us, a car accident or a house fire? And the answer is yes, we're really well protected. We have house insurance to protect against almost anything that could happen to a house, automobile, theft, the loss of the title. We can even get title insurance on our house in most jurisdictions. We can even get disability to protect against our inability to do work. So This is a really important set of risks, and we have really good vehicles for dealing with those risks, and most of us certainly take advantage of that. But if we take those and we take them onto a global scale, something truly massive, as I say, more than a hurricane, a comet, or a huge meteor, right, hitting the Earth, a nuclear war. Some people talk about Yellowstone's gonna, some huge sort of volcano. It's not fun to talk about all these things. Put a little humor there about zombie apocalypse. But can we protect ourselves against those? And the answer is really no. We can't buy insurance against those, or if we do buy the insurance, I wouldn't trust it because the insurance company isn't going to be around to pay off. A lot of people worry about this a lot. A lot of people do a thing called they become preppers. There was a National Geographic TV program about this that I enjoyed, about people going out and burying these cargo containers in underground, where they could live underground for a few months. And when I think about living underground for a few months with my family, and I'm not sure that that's really something I want to do. I think that the best view of these sorts of disasters is to simply say, well, there's really nothing we can do about it. And if that's what happens, that's what happens. And that's actually how I feel. I have no way to protect myself other than become a prepper, and I don't want to become a prepper. I certainly keep some cash available so that in a small, quick disaster, I could recover. So what we're really here to talk about today is what's here on the right-hand side, and this idea of what we would do about some sort of idiosyncratic event that happened just to us is something that we're going to talk about later on. That's the main thing that we're going to be talking about. The other thing, other half of what we're talking about is what happens if there's not an economic, a financial disaster where everybody's assets disappear. We can think of the risks over here on the real side as real economic losses. This is in the bottom left-hand corner. This is when the whole economy ceases to function well. What we're talking about on the right-hand side here is financial events, where there's a financial panic, a financial crisis, where your assets individually, or a lot of people's assets, like a huge bank, goes under, and many, many people's financial assets sort of disappear. And that's what we're going to start talking about now. I have a friend who periodically warns that everything that we talk about, stocks and bonds, is really just make believe, and it's not real, and that someday it's going to be shown to be the sham that it is. And I think he's completely wrong, but he'll just say, well, all these things are is pages out there on the cloud or in the web, and they're a bunch of electrons, and they could disappear. Maybe they could disappear because of a cyber attack and shut down our grid, or shut down the web, or everybody's records all of a sudden go poof, and they get transferred to somebody abroad, or some evil empire, or something like that. And I don't think that that's correct. And let's talk about that. What I want to do first of all is to talk about what would happen to our house. And that's going to be used as an analogy to talk about how we really are safe in this financial system. So suppose that that all the government offices in my area, it's the county clerk's office that keeps the records of who owns your houses, disappeared. I know this is ridiculous, but I want to talk about this analogy about our houses to talk about the same sort of thing that could happen to our financial accounts. So we're just setting up an analogy here. So if the county clerk's office completely disappeared, got blown up, or something like that, and there were no more government records of who owns what house, and let's just make it even worse, that when this happens, that you were on vacation and you come back to find that somebody else is living in your house. So this would be the idea: could somebody actually steal your house if all the government records of ownership were to disappear on who owns what house? And I think the answer is no, that you'd be fine. First of all, in some localities, certainly I have title insurance, and that protects me against any claim that I no longer own a house. So I could go to the title insurance company and get money in the worst case scenario. But it wouldn't even come to that because there are many, many ways that I could prove that I own my house and that you could prove that you own your house. We could show records through bank accounts of having paid utility bills, and the real estate tax records would show it, and your neighbors could come and testify to it, et cetera, and so forth. Well, the same concept here, and that is that even if some sets of records got destroyed with regard to your ownership of stocks and bonds, and even if somebody transferred all those stocks and bonds out of your account, just as your house really is protected despite some records being lost and some people stealing it temporarily, in the long run, as long as our institutions, our system of government is intact, true ownership of assets would be protected. So I don't worry about that, and we're going to get into more detail about that in a little while. Now, why don't I worry about it when it comes to stocks? Well, the question of who owns a stock is not is something that's decided by stock transfer agents. So when a company like ExxonMobil has its shareholder, its list of shareholders, that's being managed by another firm. The largest such firm, by the way, is owned by Bank of New York. It's called Computershare, and they own 40% of the market. So a company like Exxon will hire a firm like Bank of New York to keep a record of who owns the stock. That's what's really important, because when the rubber meets the road, the ownership of a stock like Exxon is not some abstract concept that only exists in a single computer somewhere. It really is the question of who does Exxon claim owns their stock? And the answer is the stock transfer agent keeps those records, and they keep them very meticulously. I did a lot of work for Bank of New York, and they have incredible backup systems to all of the records. In fact, if you look at the bottom of the slide here, we'll talk about it in a minute, there's regulations that require them to have these. So a stock transfer agent is keeping the record of who owns the stock. And when you buy the stock, they replace the sellers, the name of the people that sold the stock with your name, and you're the official owner of that stock. Well, my friend, his name is Jim, who claims that this thing is all just a bunch of fiction, says, well, so what? So what if you own the stock? What do you really own? You own just a piece of paper. And that's not true. When you own a share of Exxon, Exxon actually owns real assets. I think this is a picture of a bunch of oil drills, but I'm not exactly sure. But it was certainly a picture of, I think, of real assets, land, buildings, equipment. And if you look at ExxonMobil's balance sheet over here, you'll see this item that $258 billion of property, plant, and equipment belong to this corporation, this thing called ExxonMobil. And ExxonMobil, at least most of it, 154 billion of it, belongs to the people that are on their list. And where the rubber really meets the road is that when Exxon has profits coming in and they build up their cash and they send out dividend checks, the real question is, who are they going to send those dividend checks to? So when you own stock in Exxon, it's not just some abstract game. It is a record that says that ExxonMobil has legal right to a whole bunch of oil reserves and tankers and oil wells and perhaps refinery equipment distribution systems, and that the ownership of that asset, those assets, really belongs to Exxon, and the ownership of Exxon really belongs to you. And the proof of the pudding is that when they earn cash and they send it out in the form of dividends, it goes to you. So the whole idea of this corporation called Exxon and this stock called share in Exxon's is really simply a vehicle by which the reality takes place. And the reality that takes place is that the cash generated by these real assets go into your personal assets. You actually receive the cash from these assets. So it's not just a fake thing, it's a real thing. And what we want to be concerned about, of course, is can anybody steal our ability to get those cash flows? That's what it comes down to. Can anybody make it so that you won't be getting your dividends from ExxonMobil? And that's what we're here to talk about. Well, as I mentioned before, there's regulations. This is Section 17 of the SEC Act of 34, and this is actually the words right out of that act that they're required to be in rewritable, non-rewritable, and non-erasable format. There's strict regulations about how these records are kept. So I believe that the list of people who actually own Exxon is something that's very safe, and if you're on that list, then you're safe. There is an issue about is your name on that record, or is your stock being held in street name, which means that, well, if you have Schwab or TD Ameritrade as your brokerage account, that they're the ones that are actually getting the dividend checks, and the question is, will they distribute them to you? And we'll get to that in a few minutes. So here's the point. As long as our economic system, the underlying court systems and police and legislative systems are functioning reasonably well, then I don't think, I think there's nothing to worry about here. And by that, I mean, at some point we have to draw a line and say that this risk is so small that it's not worth worrying about. And but if the economic system truly collapses, this is the ability to milk the cows and get the milk to the store and get the milk into your refrigerator. If those things start to collapse, then that's a problem. But an important part, as I've reflected on this for quite a while, is that we have to pick our worries. And when something is very, very unlikely, or if there's something that we can't do any control over, then it's just plain not worth worrying about. I always struggled with that in my life, but I think I'm to that point now, and I urge you to reach the same conclusion. So let's go back to these four types of assets and talk about this risk of something individual happening in your life. Somebody that you become the victim of a fraud or an identity theft. I call these things idiosyncratic sorts of events. They happen to just one person or maybe just one firm, like the Enron collapse, this major energy company that much of it turned out to be just a sham. So let's talk briefly about identity theft. I talk to a lot of people about money. Obviously, that's my kind of career. And I've never personally met a person who was a victim of identity theft, but almost everybody I talk to views it as a very common occurrence. And I'll ask them, I said, well, you've never been a victim. Do you know somebody who's a victim? Oh, yes, yes. And I said, well, your brother, who is it? Well, I heard about somebody. I went to a party and I heard somebody say that they knew somebody that had this identity theft. But they don't even know anybody who's really been a victim of identity theft. And let's go further with this identity theft issue. I think we've all been victims. I certainly am a victim maybe every 3 to 5 years that I get a call from a credit card company and they say, oh, somebody, did you just buy a motorcycle in California? And I say no, and they said, okay, we'll take care of it. And it's kind of a non-event. But truly having an event where all of a sudden you can't use any of your credit cards, and you hear these disaster stories about how somebody takes off with their bank accounts get emptied, and people have taken out huge loans in their name and they can't get their federal tax refund, which I do hear about occasionally. Is that really something that happens that much? And I'd say it's very rare. I think there's a lot of people that try to sell anxiety about these things, make money off of that anxiety. I think it's pretty rare, but we want to talk about these issues and make sure that that your money at Biltmore is safe. So that's what we'll start to talk about now. So let's talk about really 4 levels of potential problems. I just covered one, which is that there would be a personal event in terms of identity theft. And with regard to that, I would urge you to maybe have some excess cash in a safety deposit box so that if your identity was completely stolen, you'd have at least enough money to go out to restaurants and pay bills for a month while you got the thing straightened out. I've never heard of anybody who's for whom this is a really long-term huge disaster. It's really just a big inconvenience. So that's the first level. I want to talk about 4 levels of problems that you can run into. So the second one I want to talk about is suppose that one of the corporations that you're investing in collapses, like an Enron. Well, to the extent that your money is in a well-diversified portfolio, an individual company going under is not a problem. So is your money in a well-diversified portfolio? Well, if your money is with Biltmore and you're in our model portfolios, you are unbelievably well diversified with regard to the number of companies. The underlying companies in every one of our model portfolios runs into the thousands of individual stocks. So even if the largest corporation in the world, Apple, were to collapse, that wouldn't be a big damage to the portfolio. Now, actually, if Apple collapsed, I think that would cause a big economic problem. Yes, that would be a big issue. But if a single company, maybe they got hit with a massive lawsuit and then they lost a lot of their wealth, that's going to have a trivial effect in your portfolio because we are unbelievably well diversified in our model portfolios. Now, we do have clients who, of course, that have concentrated stock positions because, for instance, maybe the sale of those stocks would cause a huge adverse tax consequence. You know who you are, and you know that that is risky, and something very bad could happen to that individual stock. But that's a risk that may be worth taking if the tax consequences are substantial enough. But for the money that's in the Biltmore model portfolios, you're incredibly well diversified with thousands of stocks, so you don't have to worry about a single stock event. Let's go to the next level of risk that could occur, and that is a fund level event. So the model assets are in various types of funds, exchange traded funds, closed end funds, open end funds, all sorts of different funds. And every fund that we have in these is publicly regulated, and they're almost all being held by very large, very well-known firms like Vanguard and Schwab. And when a fund like this the organizations like Vanguard and Schwab are so huge that the size itself protects them to some extent from disasters. Of course, Vanguard doesn't really hold your money. Vanguard puts your money in with custodies of banks, and the banks that they use and that Schwab uses are massive banks. And you're rather protected by simply the size of this. Even if an employee was able to strip hundreds of millions of dollars out of that organization somehow, the underlying bank or Schwab or Vanguard, they're so massive that they could weather that storm. And it's tough to steal $100 million. I mean, really, if somebody were to steal $100 million worth of stock, so to speak, it's not like a Bitcoin where the government really can't trace where the money went. If you're talking about a massive amount of money, we know where the money went. The money, you actually know if $100 million of Exxon stock were stolen from Schwab, you go to the transfer agent and find out who now claims they have ownership of that stock. So when we start to talk about these large fund groups, I think there's a lot of safety provided by that. But what about the idea that maybe one of these funds is a Bernie Madoff sort of event? Well, first of all, Bernie Madoff didn't actually have a fund. Everything he did was a fiction. So, but he portrayed that he had a fund, and it wasn't even a hedge fund. So, but Bernie Madoff was not publicly regulated, and everything that we use is publicly regulated. And I think that the probability of having a theft or a fraud sort of event at a Vanguard or a Schwab fund, and of course, as I said, most of our model portfolios are with large, well-established, well-capitalized, huge, well-known companies like Vanguard and Schwab. I think that the probability of an event happening is so minuscule that it's not worth worrying about. But even if it does happen, there are backup insurances to that. The next level I'd like to talk about is the brokerage account level. In other words, what if your brokerage account is broken into by an individual, or somebody inside of the brokerage account absconds with some of that money? Are you safe from that? Is your brokerage account safe? And we use three major custodians, brokerage firms, and Schwab, TD Ameritrade, and Pershing, which is part of the Bank of New York. These are huge organizations with literally hundreds of billions of dollars, most of them. And I'm going to most of our client money is with Schwab and TD Ameritrade. As you should know, and probably do know, Biltmore does not own your assets. We don't have custody of your assets. We simply have the limited right to cause movement of your money within Schwab. We don't have by ourselves the right to wire the money from your Schwab account into our personal checking accounts. We just have a limited powers in order to move money. So we want to talk about the protection of your money, whether you're in Schwab or whether you're in TD Ameritrade, the protection of your brokerage account. And that brings us, this is a page on Schwab. We'll get to a page on TD Ameritrade in a moment. But the first thing is that Schwab has all brokerage companies have this protection called SIPC, Securities Investor Protection Corporation. It protects $500,000 of your account against the failure of the brokerage firm. So brokerage firms do at times fail, just like banks fail. When a bank fails, we don't trust the bank, we trust the FDIC insurance up to a limit of FDIC insurance. Well, SIPC insurance is a lot like the FDIC insurance, FIDC insurance, and in that it protects you against a failure of the brokerage itself. But this may not be enough money, just like with the FDIC insurance. If you have a large enough CD, you're not protected. Well, most of our clients have a brokerage account greater than these limits. So Schwab has arranged for additional insurance with brokerage firms that provide an aggregate protection of $600 million and $1 million, as it reads here, for the individuals. So the first protection we have with Schwab is a lot of insurance protection if your money were to be, if Schwab itself were to collapse. This is a protection against Schwab collapsing. Well, is Schwab likely to collapse? Other brokerage firms have collapsed. Well, one of the neat things about Schwab is it's huge, which really provides some protection against some sort of fraud within the organization. But another thing is that Schwab does not engage in proprietary trading. In other words, some of these brokerage firms and other financial institutions engage in a thing called proprietary trading. They're out there buying things that they think are underpriced and selling things that they think are overpriced. And if their trades go in the wrong direction, sometimes instead of getting out of the trade and licking their wounds, they take even bigger gambles, trying to bring the firm back to economic health. That's what can happen with proprietary trading. Schwab does not have proprietary trading. We think it's an extremely reliable firm, and I think the chance of Schwab disintegrating, collapsing economically, and not being able to get your money through insurance is so small that I personally don't worry about it. I have a lot of my wealth with Schwab. TD Ameritrade has very parallel things. They're of course SIPC protection. In addition, they get more insurance, just like Schwab does. And to my knowledge, TD Ameritrade, and I've researched this, and to my knowledge, TD Ameritrade does not engage in proprietary trading, and it's also a large, relatively safe organization. So for both of those organizations, I think we're rather protected against these sorts of issues. Another issue that comes up, though, is what about the wiring of money away from Schwab or away from TD Ameritrade? Could a false wire be placed that would cause your money to be transferred out of Schwab or Ameritrade? And again, our account documents do not give us, Biltmore, the authority to wire money or to move money out of your brokerage accounts into any place other than what you've authorized us to do. We can't transfer the money from Schwab to quote unquote Biltmore. We can only cause movement of money, such as buying stocks, buying funds, selling funds, and however, you need, of course, you retain and you need, and we facilitate your ability to withdraw your money from Schwab or Ameritrade, and that's what wiring is all about. If you're wiring money out or you're wiring money in, you want to make sure that the money goes to where it belongs and nothing's stolen. So Biltmore internally has careful wiring procedures. When you contact us to request a wire, in most cases, we confirm through the phone or through questions that you are who you say you are. We have to get a signature authorizing the transaction. We confirm it, and then we confirm to the custodian that it's been confirmed by the client, and we contact you with a reference number. On top of that, the external, the brokerage firm, for example, Schwab, they have their careful wiring procedures, and this is actually what Schwab says that they do, and they do these things. They confirm your identity, two-factor authorization, and they have a guarantee to protect you from losses due to unauthorized activity. So I think you have a lot of protection also from the wiring. In summary, and I want to leave time here for questions and hopefully good answers, I think there are a lot of overstated risks. I think the media likes to hype risks like identity theft, about are your assets safe? I think that nothing can be 100% safe, but that, as I say here, we're one comet away from finally achieving income and wealth equality, where everybody would be at zero. Here I laugh about a comet coming, but I think that's what we need to do. We need to control everything we can control, and I think we're doing that. And with a few things that we can't control, I think we should not worry about simply because it accomplishes nothing. I would, however, like to talk about a really important risk that is a little bit on the fringe of what this is about. But it's a risk that I think is huge, and I think it's real, and I've observed a lot of it. As we grow older, we tend to lose many of us tend to lose our memory, and we tend to actually lose our judgment. I'm not a scientist, but there's medical scientific research, I believe, that establishes that the part of the brain that controls judgment is something that is not well developed in teenagers. And those of us who are parents, I think, understand that a lot of teenagers don't exhibit a lot of good judgment. It's not that they're stupid, it's that their brain hasn't developed well in terms of judgment. And it's fascinating to me to understand why our brains evolve that way for teenagers to take such risks. But they do take tremendous risks, and a lot of, certainly mine, I didn't use a lot of good judgment. In fact, when I was young, I didn't use a lot of good judgment either. Then we tend to go through the middle stages where we use a lot of good judgment. We have to be taking care of our children and running our careers. But as we grow older, we shouldn't be ashamed of this. I think we should just confront it, that a lot of us are going to lose our judgment. Not all of it, but our judgment skills will diminish. And I have seen this in my relatives, my family that came before me, that they begin to succumb to the fraud. We hear about so much senior fraud. It's because of this judgment factor. It's also because our memory starts to fade, and we kind of lose track of where our money is and what we need to do to keep that money safe. I personally have a number of relatives, and I'm not talking about 5 or 10% of the relatives that came before me, but I'd say, a third or about a third of the relatives that I should say families that I've observed, as especially when one of the spouses dies, the other spouse succumbs to various types of fraud. I've actually seen people come alongside these people and begin to take care of them. And then pretty soon, I come from more of a rural background. Pretty soon, you see a brand new pickup truck in the yard, and the remaining spouse is 80 years old, isn't going to be driving a pickup truck, but the person who's come in to take care of them is all of a sudden starting to use their wealth and take advantage of that. We know of all the senior fraud that takes place. And I guess what I think we should be focusing on in terms of risk is to make sure that we have a plan so that if one spouse dies, they have trusted people around them to help them, not just the next door neighbor or the people down the street to take care of them. So we want to have trusted networks, and it's hard to do that. I'm 62 years old, and the idea that I, at some point, am going to be transferring control of my assets to some extent to my children is scary to me. It puts us in a difficult situation, and I'd like to think that that's one of the things that Biltmore can help you with, or any other high-quality investment advisor, is to have very good relationships with key people in that organization and to have it to be a well-run organization so that they can be there to help and as our abilities decline, or as we pass our money on to our children, to be there to guide them. We can't control everything, but I think that we and other high-quality registered investment advisors can be very helpful in preventing really bad decision making due to age or through the inheritance process. That actually is a huge risk of these sorts of problems, and I don't see people worrying about that enough. So I spent a lot of time in this seminar talking about the things that, frankly, I think we shouldn't be worrying about, that we actually spend a lot of time worrying about. And the one thing that I think we should spend a lot of time worrying about that we don't is to make sure that we have a multi-generational family plan as to how the control of the assets are going to be transferred in an orderly, sane way that keeps the goals that we have in mind in place, that they'll be accomplished. So that's all I had to say, but I'd be anxious for any questions, and I'll turn it back over to Thalia, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Chambers, for your insight. We'll now go into some Q&A, and we actually had one question come in from an attendee that I see here. It says, if I have a $3 million portfolio with Biltmore, how much of that portfolio is protected?
Well, of course, it's a great question. You literally don't have that portfolio with Biltmore. You have that portfolio with Schwab or Ameritrade or Pershing. We don't have a client money. We only have a limited legal right to cause movement in that money. So your real protection is at Schwab. We do have insurance, by the way, against errors and omissions and things like that. But we don't own that money. So the question really becomes, if I have $3 million at Schwab, how can I be sure that that's protected? And that's what I was talking about here, is the protections of Schwab. They have great insurance, and frankly, I've never heard of somebody at Schwab. I mean, maybe they exist, and please email me and let me know, but I've never heard of anybody at a Schwab or an Ameritrade lose their money due to the problems of Schwab or Ameritrade. The real problems that I hear about where people lose their money, it comes from, frankly, them losing their judgment. And this fraud that takes place against seniors is horrible. So, if your money is at Schwab, I think your money is safe. And your money, once again, is not at Biltmore. We simply help you to manage that money. So I wouldn't worry about the money at Schwab. I wouldn't worry about the money at TD Ameritrade. I would focus on the idea that to make sure that you're in control of your money and that the Biltmore team or whoever you're working with is helping you to make sure that you're making good decisions with regard to that money. I hope that helps.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Chambers.
Let me add one.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Let me just add one other thing. Schwab and Vanguard don't literally hold your money as much as when it's inside of their funds. They actually have that in major banks. So it's really being held by major financial institutions, none of which am I concerned about. Thank you.
Okay. Our next question is the SIPC government backed like the FDIC?
All right. As we know, the FDIC is backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. The SIPC is not. They're very similar, but I'm not aware of any government statement that claims that the federal government will back the SIPC. However, the SIPC has a borrowing capability of, I think, $2.5 billion if they were to get into trouble. They're an insurance company, just like any other, and they do have a limited amount of money, but they have a borrowing capacity. And because they're only protecting individuals against brokerage account collapses, and they're only collecting, there's a limit to how much they protect for each customer. I think that this line of credit that they have with the Federal Reserve is adequate to cover their losses. So I think that, yes, the SIPC is safe, but once again, it's a limited amount of coverage. There's coverage beyond that with major insurance companies. But I mean, let's be honest, if a huge economic disaster occurs on the scope of a comet or something like that, I mean, the game, all the rules change. Nothing is absolutely safe, but I'm not at all worried about a brokerage account theft or a collapse of a single brokerage account.
Okay. And our next question is Schwab safer than Lehman Brothers? If so, why?
Yes, Lehman Brothers is gone. Of course, they collapsed during the financial crisis. What separates Schwab from Lehman Brothers is this issue of A, size, and B, proprietary trading. Lehman Brothers was out there. It was always referred to as a cowboy outfit because they ran their portfolios so aggressively, but they had their own very risky positions. The proprietary trading that I was talking about, that's what got them into trouble. Schwab, and to my knowledge, Ameritrade do not do these large positions, proprietary trading. They act more like a bank, if you will, and I think they're very safe. So that's the difference.
Okay. And why are Vanguard funds safer than the Bernie Madoff fund?
Okay, I did cover that specifically. I think that the answer, one of the big answers, is regulation. That Vanguard is regulated. There's rules that they have to follow, and this hedge fund industry emerged, which had safe harbors, protections from regulation. And we may talk about hedge fund strategies at Biltmore, but every fund that we're using in our model portfolios, which is almost everything, is a public fund. By public, I mean it's registered, it's closely regulated, and that's the difference. It's the funds that are not regulated. These are just private partnerships that can have those sorts of risks. So that's the big difference. These are publicly regulated funds.
Okay, and this will be our final question. So, Dr. Chambers, what if Biltmore and you and all its key people vanish? What happens?
Good question. It goes back to the point I made just a few minutes ago, which is we don't own your assets. If Biltmore simply vanished when we have our annual meeting, if the or semi-annual meeting. We just had one that if we all blew up in the same room, your wealth is with Schwab or your wealth is with Ameritrade or Pershing, and you would still have that brokerage account and you would still be getting the statements. And the only thing that you'd need to do is find somebody new that would cause them, again, give them those limited powers that you've given us to cause movements of your money, to rebalance your portfolio, to reinvest cash, and to do things like that. So your money is not with Biltmore. We have the privilege and honor of managing the money that you are holding with Schwab or Ameritrade or Pershing, and that is really your safety. Is that's where the money is.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Dr. Chambers, and thank you to everyone for your questions. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We'll be sending out an email within the next day or so that has a link to watch this webinar in case you missed any part of it. And I'll remind you, for more information on Biltmore Capital Advisors and to learn about the services we offer, visit our website, www.biltmorecap.com. And we ask that you go ahead and like and follow us on Facebook, just so you can stay on top of all of our future webinar events, as well as industry relevant news. Again, thanks for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.